What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today we're going to be discussing how to work the scene in street photography. And honestly, just being straight up with you, this is probably the most important video I'm making to date on street photography because I believe there's misconceptions about street photography and the decisive moment and when the photographer pressed the shutter. How did he make that photo? Was it one click and he moved on? Well, I'm here to dispel that myth and describe to you how I personally work the scene and how it takes a lot of time to make a photograph sometimes, where honestly a lot of these photographs that I've made, they came with lots of clicks, lots of presses of the shutter, and a lot of time spent. And most of the time, I don't leave the scene until the scene leaves me. And so I want to describe to you in this video through some photography, through some contact sheets, and some behind the scenes video footage of me at the scene, how I work the scene and how I come home with more compelling imagery because of the way that I work the scene. And hopefully at the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of what working the scene means and how you can apply this to your street photography, where ultimately I believe the best shots come from patience, the positioning of your physical body and relationship to the moment, and persistence through photographing with repetition at a scene. So don't just take one shot and move on. Work the scene and find the best way to make a composition. And here I'm standing on top of the wall that separates Israel and Palestine. And so you may be wondering, well, how did I have access to photograph here? How did I make this photograph of this boy throwing this baby stroller against the wall? And well, I'll tell you, it came through courage. It came through repetition. It came through me going out there over and over again in attempts to making a photograph of the wall. I had this initial interest of the wall when I traveled to Israel, and I wanted to photograph this particular location, this particular impactful wall in an image, right? I wanted to make a photograph of the wall. And so I went there time and time again with repetition, week after week, going back again and again. And when I tell you, nothing really occurs around this wall. There's a few scenes that I discovered. There's a few different moments of some children playing, but it's very empty. It's very desolate. And it's very difficult to find anything interesting to photograph around this wall, frankly. But over time, with persistence and going back there week after week, I was able to come home with this photograph. And so we'll be looking at the contact sheet, the behind the scenes of how the photograph was made. And hopefully you'll have a better understanding of how I work the scene here. And so you can see in this contact sheet, around the top of this contact sheet, we have the initial moment here that I'm circling in red. We have the boy in red that I photographed ultimately. We have another boy in gray. They're throwing rocks, right? They're being playful. You can see here this boy throwing the stone over the wall. I'm working the scene. I'm stepping back. I'm noticing here initially the moment they found the stroller, right? So they found the stroller. They're throwing the stroller against the wall here around this wall. And, what I've done here to make this composition was make the position of my body very particular to make the composition, meaning I'm photographing with a very flat composition here. You can see that he went to throw the baby stroller a few times. I had the time to change my perspective to come to the ultimate outcome of this photograph. And so by photographing through the scene, by watching it unfold naturally, I was able to come home with this image where I repositioned my body for the second time where he went to throw the stroller and realized in that split moment that by photographing from his back, looking towards the wall, the photograph fell flat. But by repositioning my body and adjusting the composition, I was able to make a photograph with more impact, where we have this long looming wall and the shadow that's casted upon it, which makes the photograph more visually and emotionally impactful and becomes a more mysterious frame where you're wondering, why? What is this? What is going on here? But the reposition of my body, the way in which I adjusted myself with a very simple couple of steps to the right, and by looking down the wall and allowing the wall to form a leading line to the horizon, I was able to break the frame up in a much more simple approach, revealing the shadow in that moment. And so I was able to create a photograph with more visual impact because I was working the scene, because I photographed through this moment and I allowed the moment to occur one more time one more time, and then I adjusted and pressed the shutter. And so it's really important for you to not just go to a location one time and make a photograph, or even just work the scene for a few minutes, but maybe go back for a couple of weeks. I mean, this to me is what the art of working the scene is all about. You know, here in my hometown, Philadelphia, I'll go back time and time again and make photographs of the same locations, trying to work the scene at the same space over and over again throughout the different changes of seasons. And so while I spent time here in Israel, I was able to visit the wall over and over again, and then by working the scene in the moment, come home with this very impactful photo. And so courage, I believe, is at the forefront of our practice as street photographers. Core meaning heart. A photograph is a reflection of our heart, of our courage. And I believe we all have fear. We all go out there and we feel anxiety when we're pressing the shutter sometimes. I still feel fear if I'm in a certain situation and I don't want to take a photo. You know, you feel awkward sometimes. But through mustering up courage, despite the fear, you can push onwards to the front lines of life to make these photographs. And so we're going to be looking at some behind the scenes of some footage of me photographing conflict situations in Jericho as a way for me to describe to you why this is important and how I use fear to get closer to life to make photos.
Dante, I'm out here in the middle of the checkpoint at Jericho, and I'm making photographs of the clashes. There's a lot of shots going off, but I'm trying to get the shot. Watch me get the shot.
أنا خسران يا أخو النايم خسران راحت
Try and get the layers. Wait for him to throw it, get the shot. Oh, he jumped in the air. I think my shutter stopped when I shot that. Let's back up. So what our tactic is we move in for, you know, a good 30 seconds and then we move back because they're shooting a lot. And yeah, I have no words. My heart is speaking for itself. It's moving fast, getting that adrenaline rush. It's pretty nice weather. It's not that hot, you know. It's pretty good. Got my shorts on. It's just a quick vacation for the weekend in Jericho. So, bye.
And so when I'm working the scene in these heated environments, I'm laser focused on the moment. I'm trying to get close to the subject. I'm moving back, waiting for him to leap and to throw the rock. And by visiting these borders and these checkpoints over the many months I spent in Israel, I was able to photograph these conflict situations time and time again. And through going out here and trying over and over again, I came home with this photograph from a very different moment, a different scene, but ultimately became the impactful photograph that I made of the conflict. Through going back there over and over again and mustering up the courage to push myself closer and closer, I came home with the photograph of this tattered masked man.
That's a cool picture.
And so you can see the contact sheet behind the scenes of how this particular photograph was made. And I made very simple compositional decisions by working this scene. You know, as I observed this masked man, I placed him on the right-hand side in relationship to the smoke on the left-hand side, breaking the composition up with a simple rule of thirds. The thing that makes this photograph, however, so impactful is not only the smoke and the mask, but the impact of me positioning my body as physically close to the scene as I can. The camera was essentially focused on his eye as close as humanly possible and as technically possible as I could with this camera. And so filling the frame with visual and emotional impact can create more compelling imagery. But once again, this comes through working the scene. This comes through patience. This comes through courage. And so courage, I believe, is something that I just wanted to discuss very briefly in the beginning of this video as we discuss working the scene, because I seriously believe that Photography, it has nothing to do with photography. And what do I mean by this? Anyone can go out there and make a photograph. Anyone can go out there and put together a foreground, a middle ground, and background and recognize the visual game of putting together a composition. Okay, this is simple, okay? Photography has everything to do with how you engage with humanity out there on the front lines of life, close to people, close to life itself, close to humanity. And by engaging with humanity in your own unique way, you can come home with more impactful photographs. And I believe it's critical in my practice to embrace the spirit of play. Now, when I'm on the streets and I'm photographing, even in these conflict situations, do you think I'm out there thinking to myself, oh, I'm a visual storyteller. I'm here to make the world a better place and change the world with my photographs. I hope Times Magazine sees this. I hope, I'm not out there like expecting anything. I'm not out there as this like serious documentary photographer. Let me put my photography hat on today and make these visual stories. No, I'm out there and I'm a big kid with a camera embracing the spirit of play. And this is how a lot of my photographs have been made, through the spirit of play, through me being there and being present when I press the shutter, through me observing and having fun. There's this approach to photography that I've adopted that embraces the spirit of play at the forefront. As much as courage is important, I also want to make sure that you understand that I'm not a serious photographer. And so we'll be discussing more about that. But ultimately, I wanted to share with you this photograph here of a boy playing with his donkey. And so in Jericho, we have a lot of trash that is burned. And so as they burn the trash, the smoke rises. And I photographed at this particular scene as I was intrigued by the donkey. And I noticed the boys passing by. And so I got close and I was playful at the scene. And I was joking with the boys. And I observed the background where we have this beautiful mountaintop. And we have the smoke rising. And so you can see here where I made the final frame, the keeper photo, the moment unfolded naturally, right? So you can see, if I zoom in here, the boy is trying to mount his donkey. He's playing with his donkey. He's hiding behind the donkey. He sees me with the camera. But over time, the scene unfolded naturally, and he revealed to me his face behind the donkey in the spirit of play. And that's how this photograph was made. It was through me not taking myself so seriously. And then him revealing himself behind the donkey becomes more mysterious in the photograph. And it adds intrigue with the use of the smoke in the background. And so I made some very simple compositional decisions here at the scene in the moment by observing the background and setting my stage initially. You can see this beautiful mountain range. We have this smoke here that's rising. We have this leading line that's formed from the path. And then finally, in the foreground of the frame, the donkey that makes this beautiful shape. And the obvious moment being this boy being revealed from the donkey. And so when you're in the moment and you're working a scene, I believe it's very critical to understand the different relationships that you can make between the person, between the subject, the moment, and the background. And so ultimately, I formed this composition by working the scene and observing the scene as it unfolded naturally through the spirit of play, looking at the mountain, understanding the element of the smoke, and plugging the foreground with the donkey. And so working the scene in the spirit of play is a very important part of my process, and I can't stress it enough. Photography has everything to do with how you engage with humanity. And here I entered Shofat refugee camp in East Jerusalem, where I made the photograph of the wall. However, when I enter through this checkpoint, when I enter through the wall, there's a big looming wall. You get your passport out, you get your bag, you put it through the x-ray machine. The Israeli soldiers are looking you up and down, wondering why this American person is coming into this community. You go through the checkpoint, you're locked in, the barbed wire fence, and then you're there and you're present. And what are you going to do when you're in this walled community? Are you going to be fearful? Are you going to stand across the street with your camera, right, and try to take pictures of people? No. You embrace the spirit of play. You get close to the people that you photograph. You have an interaction at the scene. You engage with your photography openly and honestly, with authenticity at the forefront. And this is how I work the scene. I go out there in the spirit of play. And so watch this behind the scenes video as I make some photographs of a scene. And this is actually a perfect example of how I work the scene, through interaction, through positioning my body in various ways, through getting close from backing up, and then watching the scene unfold naturally. I was able to come home with this photograph. And so you'll see the result at the end of the video.
Hi. Is it okay if I take a photograph of the, yeah? Shukran. The sun, it's beautiful. And the green, the color, nice, yes. What time do you eat? Ramadan? Not now. Okay, after 12, wow. I'm from America. Yes. Trump? Maniac. Yeah. Yeah, he's crazy, a little crazy. Yeah. In America, I live in Philadelphia. Yes. Oh, nice. Oh, cool. Miami's beautiful. Forza Saída.
And so here you have the result of this interaction at the scene. It happened very naturally. And what was the thing that intrigued me to make this photograph? What was it? When I approached this scene, I was describing the beautiful popping color of the green watermelon. I could sense the possibility of a photograph. There was beautiful light. It was extremely striking. And then the decisive moment, it unfolded naturally, but I understood that there was a potential photograph to make here. And by being patient and positioning my body in various ways and being observant and being playful, I came home with this photo. And so, as you see, we have this beautiful use of light and shadow. There's this triangle that reveals his smile. And this is something that I was intrigued by initially. It was this beautiful crushing shadow area, the way the light illuminates, the way the shadows were casted on this wall. We have these very simple elements of light and shadow that make this photograph visually interesting, that made this scene come to life. It's the light that shapes and gives form to the surfaces and the moments that we photograph. And then ultimately, over time spent at the scene, by being playful, I came home with this decisive moment of the man gesturing, throwing the watermelon on his head. And I have this man in the background, and we have a very beautiful moment with a joyous smile. There's an emotional and visual impact here that was made through time spent working the scene and embracing the spirit of play. And so I'm able to come home with a lot of these photos through the use of a particular technique where I carry around an Instax camera and approach the scene. And so you can see this photograph I made inside of somebody's home in Jericho. And you might be wondering, well, how did I get access? How did I get in someone's home and make a photograph and work this scene? Well, I have an Instax camera, and I make photos of strangers, and I gift them a print right there at the moment, and I'm playful, and I'm open, and I'm not taking myself so seriously. You can see here in this Instax photo me lounging inside of a Palestinian woman's home at the scene. And so how did I make this photo? How did I get access to rise to the top of the Wadi Kelt mountain range in Jericho and make a photo of this dramatic scene as the car broke down and the clouds are in the background and it's this beautiful moment? Well, I have an Instax camera, right? You can see in Arabic my name written there alongside the two Jalan brothers. I had a great time. I went on a hike to the top of the mountain. I drank tea and coffee with this group of brothers. But this came through the spirit of play. This came through me being curious. I went to the masjid, I was praying, and then they observed me after the prayer session, and they were wondering why I was praying there, as I'm an American, and they invited me to their home, and they took me on this trip, and I spent an entire day to come home with this photograph. And I want to share with you a behind the scenes video of how joyful photography can be and how enriching this experience can be through working the scene, through embracing the moment and putting yourself out there in the world. You can have these experiences that will stand the test of time through the photographs you make, through the memories that you can share, and through the experiences you have along the way. And so working the scene to me is more than just composing an image in the moment and watching it unfold, but it's through going out there and experiencing life in all of its complexities. And so as we hiked to the top of the mountain, the car broke down, and we had to get out of the car and push it up the mountain in order to have it restart again. But as you can see in this contact sheet, I worked the scene. As the car broke down, I made some simple compositional decisions at the scene. And I was able to make many different photographs where you can see initially I'm actually photographing as we're on the journey, going up the mountain, using the reflection of the window, photographing out the window. The car breaks down, I'm on my toes, I have to respond quickly at the scene. I make this very simple decision to photograph the car. The composition falls flat. The man gets out of the car, he moves towards the car. The composition still falls flat. But by including the car in the foreground of the frame, I was able to create a more impactful photograph. And so I want to explain to you how I work the scene through the use of this contact sheet, making these very simple compositional decisions. I get back in the car. I'm continuously making new photographs at the scene. I'm using the frame of the window to make a composition, and I'm photographing as they're climbing to the top of the mountain, wondering how to fix this car. I'm photographing through the scene as it unfolds. But it was the moment where I decided to incorporate this foreground element of the car that created more visual impact and more depth to the photo, where we have these very simple decisions to make when we're on the street. When we're out there in the world and a car breaks down and you're on your toes, you have to respond quickly. For me, this composition is a perfect textbook example of the use of layering, where I have the background element filled with the beautiful popping blue color and clouds. I have the middle ground element filled with the interest in the frame being the people there gathered around the car. And then finally, the foreground that I plugged in with this visual element that helps tell the story at the scene. And, these very simple compositional decisions we can make through working the scene, through observing your foreground, your middle ground, and your background, and positioning your physical body in relationship to these elements, we can create a compelling photograph through making pictures through the scene as it unfolds naturally. And so you must have this art of observation, observing the patterns in nature and human behavior, whether you're looking at the light or the way the people move on the street with their feet. By having this sharp visual acuity, you can put together these frames very naturally over time. And so here at this scene in Old City, Jerusalem, I photographed as the Jewish men were in prayer at the Wailing Wall. And so as I photographed this scene at the wall, actually you can see I wasn't necessarily making anything interesting visually. At the wall, it's very stagnant. At the wall, all they're really doing is praying and they're in a line and there's not much movement or dynamics to work with. And so I found that the photograph kind of just fell flat to me. And so the moment wasn't necessarily interesting at the wall itself. However, by observing on the left-hand side, the men engaged here at the scene going to the bathroom, as there's a bathroom in the background, I was able to come home with a much more interesting photograph. And so when you're at a scene, observe the peripherals. Don't just photograph the obvious thing itself, being the men in prayer, but by observing the way in which they're moving in and out of the bathroom, I was able to make this photograph through having this art of observation dialed in. By observing the scene itself, I was able to then work this particular scene by positioning myself facing the opposite direction, by not looking at the obvious interaction of the men in prayer, but by watching the movement of their feet and observing the patterns as they're going in and out of this bathroom. I made this photograph that is much more visually compelling through the use of layering and the movement of the people that add a visual dynamic to the photograph. And so by observing the patterns in the way that people move and the way that they gesture, and observing the scene itself and understanding the relationships you can make, this can improve your ability to make more interesting photographs, where we want to find a strong foundation to work with, by observing the dynamics of light, by observing the different gestures and the movement of people. We can have this potential to make a stronger photograph. And so finding a scene and watching it unfold naturally is very critical in my practice, and photographing a lot. How many photographs are on the screen? Maybe 70, right? I make a lot of photographs. Sometimes you'll make 100 clicks. And so maybe I can zoom in and just scan around just very briefly at this context sheet so you can see the different dynamics at the scene. We have children playing, we have shadows and light, we have this potential photograph to make here. I had this very strong foundation to work with, right? I could sense the possibility of a photograph here by observing the shadow play, by observing the light and the beautiful background. I set my stage and I waited patiently to press the shutter at this decisive moment as the boy enters the patch of light with that interaction between the shadow and the background. But I didn't just stop there, okay? I kept making photos. I kept making pictures. I got closer. I used the shadow. I got to make more images than I needed. But by photographing through the scene and remaining consistent through this practice of working the scene, I was able to come home with this image. I didn't leave the scene until the scene naturally died down, right? So you can see here, even I made more photos, right? And I kept going. And I kept going and going and going until they stopped playing. And once they stopped playing, I stopped photographing, right? But some of these other images on the context sheet, they're also beautiful. But it was this moment, this interaction between the light and shadow play and the way the boy's eye is being revealed in relationship to the shadow casted on the wall that elevated this moment of the children playing to a new height. And so ultimately, making this photograph, I put together the composition very particularly, however. And so what is the photographer responsible for? The photographer is responsible for where they position their physical body in relationship to the moment and the background. And so by positioning my physical body closer to this boy, closer to this subject of interest, and closer to that interaction between the light and shadow play, I was able to create this frame. And I was able to break this composition up with very simple decisions using the layering technique by working the scene. And so by positioning my body and my camera close to this boy here in the foreground, right, and filling the frame with this dynamic interplay between the light and shadow, and positioning the shadow play on the background, and having these different relationships made very naturally between the children playing, I was able to create a frame with more visual impact. I was able to break this frame up using this pole. I was able to set my stage, filling the environment in the background with that tattered wall. And so understanding where you must position your physical body in relationship to the subject in the background is what photography is all about. To me, that's what the photographer is responsible for. And those decisions that we make are reflected in the photographs. And so I believe it's important to make many different variations at a scene. Rarely it's the first photograph that you make that's going to be the keeper photograph. Shoot from a wide angle, get close to the subject, try from a high angle, try a low angle, right? Try with the background or without the background. You can make so many different photos of the same scene with practice and with repetition. And so here, as I photographed this scene in Napoli, these men were gathered by the Mediterranean Sea, grabbing this watermelon out of the water, and they started to break it up. And so as this man was breaking the watermelon up, what did I do? I got really close to the scene. I photographed as he unfolded the watermelon very naturally. I was engaged in the process. I was watching as he sliced it with his knife here. And then as they started to share it, as he started to reach with this gesture, and he started to give it to his friends, I backed up. I went from that wide angle to from that close angle, that close-up shot, to a much more wide shot, allowing the background to be filled. And so by observing the scene and working the scene, I was able to come home with a more interesting photograph where honestly I spent maybe like 2 hours at this scene. I was here on a vacation with my brother, and we were swimming, we were eating watermelon with these guys. They were serving us live fish right off the rocks. I was just lounging, enjoying the day. But through just being there and being present, and then working the scene, this kind of just unfolded naturally. And sometimes the best photographs happen when you least expect it. And so it's important for me to always have a camera with me. And so, yeah, I essentially filled the frame here through the layering technique of positioning the man in the foreground. And by creating a visual feast, I was able to create this dynamic energy in a photo, where I believe that creating a visual feast is all about making the frame full of energy, full of movement and dynamics, and giving the viewer this pleasant experience through the way in which their eyes travel around the frame, where we have in the foreground the man here holding the watermelon, and we have the watermelon as the obvious point of interest, and then finally this man here revealed swimming in the background. And so by making these very simple relationships and positioning my body in this very particular way, by using that man that's highlighted in yellow in the background as my anchor point and trying to relate the foreground to the background, I was able to create this very dynamic visual feast naturally through the way in which things fall within my composition, where your eye can now travel through the use of the popping color and contrast of the watermelon to the background and then to the foreground and back again. And so we have this spiral composition that's formed through me working the scene and positioning the different elements from the foreground to the background, where the photograph becomes so vibrant and full of life and energy through creating this visual feast, through filling the frame with this dynamic energy. And so by moving around and changing my perspective, I was able to create that frame. By getting close to the subject and then moving back as the scene unfolded naturally, I was able to create a more dynamic photograph. And so it's very important for you to go out there when you're working the scene to not just photograph from one angle. Don't just stay laser focused on one way of shooting the scene, but to reposition your body, to move to the left, to move to the right, to drop down low, to try a higher perspective, right? Every little simple step that you take changes the composition drastically. So don't be static when you're working the scene. Move your physical body around. And so here in this scene where I photographed the baptism, I was essentially photographing initially from a wide perspective. I was trying to capture all of the people within the frame, and I have a photograph here of the scene. And so it was a very dynamic scene. And so as I watched the baptism and the way that these moments unfolded naturally, I realized that I needed to drop to a low angle, changing my position to create this photograph. And so you can see in this context sheet, I was actually initially photographing the scene from a higher angle. And so you can see here, I'm photographing as the dunk occurs up here, as I'm highlighting in red, right? You can see I'm looking at the way they're dunking the man and the man and the woman. And so I'm watching that and thinking, maybe that's the moment to photograph. And so actually, I didn't wind up going through with that idea. I dropped low as I observed the gesture, and the way in which the preacher raised his hand before the dunk. And so by repositioning my body and by moving around and dropping to a low angle, I was able to create this photograph with more impact by positioning his gesture against that blue sky and separating the subjects in a more seamless way. I was able to create a more dynamic frame. And ultimately, by filling the frame with these different elements, by having the strong gesture and having the strong gaze of the man's eyes, we have this surprise. We have this mysterious photo. I mean, obviously it's of a baptism, but the way I frame things becomes more dramatic with the use of the gestures, with the way the man is looking with his eyes. You know, there's this tension in the frame through filling the frame here by dropping low and having that blue sky as the clean backdrop. I was able to create this frame. I was able to fill this frame with this dynamic energy. And so by positioning your body in different ways, by observing these scenes and the way they unfold naturally, you can come home with a stronger photograph through working the scene. You know, here at this scene, I'm photographing a funeral, right? So I got to photograph funerals and baptisms. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia, Africa. I spent over a year there learning the local language, Ichibemba, integrating myself in the Bemba tribe, and living amongst these people here in the Luapula province in the Samfia district of Impanta village. And so I was there at the scene. I was present. I was watching as these moments unfolded naturally in these tense situations. And so ultimately, by working this scene and being present and being observant as this funeral unfolded, I was able to come home with a very emotionally compelling photograph. And so as they began digging and burying the dead here in the dirt, I came home with an image that I believe to be very emotionally striking. And so I essentially watched as the scene unfolded, right? You can see I'm looking at the way the smoke is and the dust is filling the frame. I'm watching as that gesture of the man is digging with that hoe. And I'm watching as the people are mourning in the background. And as this man began to mourn, I could sense the possibility of a photo here. I could follow and track his gesture. You know, as he started to mourn, I followed him. I observed him. And as he dropped to a low angle and began to mourn in front of the scene, I made this photograph. And so it's very important to be present when you're in these situations and to be observant and to be there physically and emotionally to make these kind of photos. And so by tracking the subject and dropping low, I filled the frame with this emotional and visually dynamic energy, and ultimately came home with this photograph of the man mourning at the funeral in Zambia. And so your intuition will guide you on the streets. And so when I'm out there and I'm watching these moments unfold, I'm following my intuition. And ultimately, a composition, it's a result of your intuition, that instinct, that gut reaction when you press the shutter. And so I believe that ultimately, by observing these gestures, by observing the man mourning, by observing children playing and flying and doing backflips, by observing the different ways that people move on the street, we're timing these moments, we're making these photographs through our gut, through our intuition and our timing. And so when you're observing these scenes and they're unfolding naturally, don't be afraid to spend a lot of time, right? Like you can see here at this context sheet as these boys were playing and making backflips at the scene. I stayed for a long time. I made lots of photographs of the scene. I wasn't afraid to watch as the scene unfolded naturally, to come home with this dynamic photograph of the boy in mid-flight. And so I dropped to a low angle and separated that moment from the background and trusted my gut and my instinct when I pressed the shutter at this moment. But it came through lots of clicks of the shutter. It came through me trying time and time again. It came through me observing the same pattern as the boys flipped over and over. And then over time, through working the scene, I came home with this photograph, where photography is very physical. You know, as much as photography is this visual game of putting together the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, and we have two eyes that are connected to our brain that allow us to perceive the world with sharp visual acuity, the composition derives through your gut. The composition derives through your intuition, through your 2 feet and the movement of your physical body in relationship to these moments. And so recognize that photography is physical. It's going to require you to drop down low. It's going to require you to reposition your body in relationship to the moment to make these photos. And so it's important to be able to anticipate the movement and the interactions and the gestures that occur out there in the world. And so as I was out here photographing at this scene on the lake Benguelu in Zambia, Africa, as my friend Amaz is washing his face, I was patient and I just let the scene unfold naturally. I was enjoying the day, just going for a nice boat ride with my friend. He was showing me the route that he takes when he goes for his transport trips. And, you know, I was looking not necessarily at the most obvious moment of, you know, just a man on a boat, but I was looking at the sort of different elements that I could combine and the different simple and small moments, like this simple shift in the body of the man gesturing, cleaning his face, and the interaction between the man in the background and the oar, and these different moments that aren't necessarily so obvious, but by understanding that pattern in his gesture and the way that he's moving and rowing the boat over and over again, I was able to combine that element of him rowing in relationship to my friend Amaz here washing his face. And I ultimately came home with this photograph here that you see on the screen. And it became something very intuitive where I definitely am hyper aware of these gestures, of these moments, of these movements and these patterns that exist in the way that people interact at scenes. And so it's very critical for you to simply be present, to be aware, to be observant, and to be there when you press the shutter, as present as you can be, you know, where you're simply laser focused on the moment. And this is what's going to allow you the ability to come home with these more compelling photos, is through actually being there when you press the shutter and being hyper aware of these patterns and these gestures. It will influence the way that you can make a photo. And so sometimes it's best to know when to move on. You know, like I said, I like to leave the scene when the scene leaves me, but sometimes the energy dies down, you know, nothing new is happening and the light is maybe shifted and it's time to leave, right? And you tried all these different angles and there's more, and you know, there's no more potential at the scene. You know, it's important to know when to stop working the scene as well. And this is something very intuitive and something very natural and on a case-by-case basis. However, I wanted to share with you some behind-the-scenes footage of how I work the scene out there in the streets. And so I'm going to share with you this video where I ultimately come home with this photograph of a mother and a child interacting on a railroad in a very playful image. And you're going to see the way that I interact and work scenes here in this video, where I essentially wound up making that photo that you saw previously here on the slide of the bird and this beautiful scene in Mumbai right after this this video that I'm going to share with you. And so I want to share with you this behind the scenes footage as another example of how I personally work the scene and get close to people through the spirit of play, through interaction, and then come home with these photographs. Assalamu alaikum. It's okay? For me? Thank you. Very good. Very good. Assalamu alaikum. Tea is good. The chai is good. Very, very, very good. I like. It's okay. Very beautiful. Thank you. And so you could see I knew when to move on from these different scenes, right? I was given free coffee. I sat down and drank the tea, right? I made a photograph and then I moved on, right? I went to the railroad just outside of this village, and as I walked along the railroad, I noticed these different families and these different interactions that were occurring. You know, I made a photograph of that scene with those many people and the baby there on the lap, and then I moved on, right? I could sense that I made enough photos there, time to move on. I noticed this gesture here and the way that the mother was combing the hair of the daughter, and I knew that this was the moment to press the shutter. And so I got close, I asked for permission, and I made this photo here. And so ultimately, once I finished making this photograph, I actually decided that it's time to leave the scene. And so I hopped on a taxi from this location. And as I left the scene, I went to the next spot. You know, I knew that it was time to leave. Basically, once I made that photo, I was like, okay, I'm done here. I'm not going to top this. Let me just leave. I get on this taxi, and I'm still in the same area. So this is Bandra in Mumbai, and then I move on to Bandra Fort, which is by the seaside. And so essentially I visit these very particular locations when I go on these trips because I am aware of the potential of a photograph because of the light. The light is very important to me, and understanding at certain times of day where the light will be is very critical when you're on the streets. And so I visited this location because I knew that it was the sunset. It was that beautiful time to photograph during the golden hour, and during the golden hour and during the sunset, I know that I can catch these beautiful moments using the light by the sea. Because the sea is so open, when you're by the beach or you're by these open spaces, there's no buildings that are blocking your view. There's no buildings that are blocking the light itself and the sun. And so by working this scene and going around in loops over and over again, I was able to make these different relationships between the fort and the form and the geometry and the way that I could fill the frame here. I was recognizing the patterns of the birds that were in flight, and I was observant of these very simple things that I could combine to make a more compelling photograph. And so by positioning myself in the front here, using the fort as my stage, I waited for the bird in flight to make this amazing frame, where ultimately this came through me being out there, being present, working the scene, and understanding the patterns that exist with the way the light falls, with the way the birds are flying, and positioning my body in a particular way in relationship to this empty frame here, to this fort here in Bandra. I was able to make a more dynamic photo using the use of layers, using this window as a frame within a frame as my first compositional decision. By plugging that man there in the window frame, I have an anchor point to work with. And by positioning myself at this choke point where we have these three women and we have people moving in and out of that doorway, I could sense the possibility of something here. And by positioning that man there in the window in relationship to the foreground, all that was left for me to do was to wait for the third element, being the bird in flight. And so this bird in flight is the cherry on top and the thing that I was waiting for that made the photograph more dynamic and interesting. But it came through me being observant. It came through me going out there and understanding the way the light is falling at this location, by understanding the relationships that I can make between the birds in flight and the people, by understanding the geometry and the form and the way that I can make this composition, right? It's very much about persistence. You know, working the scene is about going out there and photographing consistently and practicing as much as humanly possible. You know, I still to this day, I'm shooting daily. I'm going out there and I'm photographing over and over again. And when I'm out there on the streets and I sense the possibility of something, I don't leave the scene until the scene leaves me. And so once this bird flew by and I made this frame, I knew I made that shot. Well, honestly, you know, all the stars aligned. And then I moved on and I knew it was time. And so by reviewing your photographs, you can understand that it's not just luck. You know, like when I look at that frame, you might think, oh, is that luck? You know, you got the bird in flight. No, it comes through pattern recognition. It comes through the way that I position myself. It comes through me understanding how to be ready, you know, when this lucky occurrence occurs, you know. And so I encourage you to study your photographs, you know, to look at your frames and maybe make decisions later, you know, understanding, you know, should I have angled myself differently at this moment? You know, what did I do here at this scene, you know? And over time, you know, by studying your photos and looking at them, you know, where I like to print my photos out. So you can see here on my wall here, I've got a wall of the photos that we've been looking at. I got a wall of photographs here. I've got a bunch of photographs in like these sketchbooks and stuff. And so I study a lot of my photos. Here's the Instax photo that I've shared on the slideshow. Here's the wall. And so, yeah, I think that if you print your photos out, if you study your photos, I highly suggest getting a Canon Selfie CP1500 printer. I have a sketchbook here. This is one of my first sketchbooks. And Yeah, you can see that I study my work. You know, when I first started shooting on the streets of Baltimore and Philadelphia, I would make these very small thumbnail-sized prints. I would take notes. I was very organized, and I still do this to this day, where I make very small sketchbooks and I carry them around with me as a way for me to study my photos. And so by studying your photography, you can understand why you're making certain decisions, how you're making certain decisions, and what you can do differently when you're out there in these situations. And so here at this scene in Philadelphia, I was photographing a bus stop. I sensed the possibility of a photograph to make here. I was intrigued by that shaft of light and the way the light and shadow play interacted at the scene. And then ultimately, over time, through observing the light and being patient and positioning myself at this choke point where I could sense that people were moving. You know, at these bus stops, we have people waiting for the bus. People are going to catch the bus. People are walking in the background on the sidewalk. You know, there's something here. You know, I could sense the possibility of something here. And I stayed there and I was patient and I was working the scene. And so I treated this composition like visual problem solving. And so I like to think of solving, these visual problems when I'm on the street, where life becomes like a visual puzzle, and I'm trying to simply position myself in a way that I can relate the different elements in my frame to create cohesion in a photograph. And so similar to the scene you just saw in Mumbai, I used this technique of visual problem solving to create this composition. And so initially I was intrigued by this shaft of light. I was looking at the light. I could sense the possibility of something here because of the way the light gave shape and form to the surface around me. However, by positioning this pole here in the background, I was able to create this anchor point. I was using the technique of working from back to front, similar to the way I positioned that man in the window. I positioned this frame, this sign here, in that empty space in relationship to the blue sky in the background to create an anchor point and this way in which I can make the formal decision of the composition. And then by being patient and working the scene and observing the patterns of people moving in and out, I was able to create the relationship between this man who's a silhouette here in relationship to the man coming out from that beam of light. And so this is something very intuitive in the way that I photograph certain situations, where I work back to front, sometimes front to back. It's very dependent on the scene, but these different elements that you combine become very natural, and it's very similar to this notion of visual problem solving. And so when you're working the scene and you're observant of these things, you can be patient and wait for things to unfold naturally. And so I encourage you to go out there and to keep moving, keep experimenting. When you're photographing and you're working a scene, don't just stay stagnant and still. You know, sometimes it requires you to move to the left, to move to the right, to move down low, right? As much as photography is this visual game of visual problem solving, it's a physical pleasure of you moving your body out there and making adjustments with your 2 feet to create and to compose these photos. And so be patient. Be observant, go out there and be consistent with your practice. And over time, you will make better photographs. But ultimately, through studying through these, slideshows and looking at some of these videos, context sheets, behind the scenes videos, photos, etc., you can maybe build a stronger foundation for you to go out there and do the thing. Because ultimately, no amount of studying, no amount of looking at these posts are going to help you. But actually going out there and doing the thing itself, and actually putting these ideas into practice will be the thing that transforms your photography. So just recognize that you must go out there and to do the thing itself. However, if you want to learn more, feel free to read my blog posts, dantesisofo.com. You got DANTESISOFO.com, or simply go to youtube.com/street photography. Feel free to share this video or any of the videos on my YouTube channel with a friend. If you have a friend in your town that also practices street photography and you're both trying to learn, let's all learn together. Let's all grow together. Hopefully some of the ideas I have in this video can help you along your journey. And today's topic, working the scene, pretty important stuff, honestly. And so I was really eager to make this one today. Anyways, gonna go hit the streets now, and remember, don't take yourself so seriously. Go out there and embrace the spirit of play when you're making photographs and you're working these scenes. You don't have to take it so seriously. And that's, to me, the key for how I've personally improved my photography. And so I'm sharing that with you. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.